63% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Not just people earning minimum wage. Not just people in poverty. People earning $50,000 a year. People earning $100,000 a year. People earning $150,000 a year. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, teachers. People who by any reasonable measure have decent incomes are one missed paycheck away from not being able to pay their bills. And the conventional explanation is, Americans are bad with money. Americans can't delay gratification. Americans are too focused on consumption. That explanation is wrong, or at least deeply incomplete. Because the real reason most Americans live paycheck to paycheck has almost nothing to do with individual financial irresponsibility. It has everything to do with the system that has been engineered to extract maximum value from working people while making the extraction invisible. Today, we're going to talk about what's actually happening, not the surface story, the structural story that explains why 63% of Americans are financially fragile regardless of what they earn. The wage stagnation that nobody talks about. Let's start with the foundational economic reality. In 1970, the average American worker could buy a home with roughly 3 to 4 times their annual income. Today, the average American home costs roughly 7 to 8 times the average annual income. Housing has gotten dramatically more expensive relative to wages. But it's not just housing. Let's look at other major expenses. Healthcare. In 1980, Americans spent about 5% of household income on healthcare. Today, it's closer to 12 to 17%, including premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs. Education. In 1980, 1 year of public university tuition was roughly $3,000 in today's money. Today, it's roughly $10,000 to $25,000 depending on the state. Private universities are dramatically higher. Childcare. The average cost of childcare in America today is roughly $10,000 to $18,000 per year per child. In the 1980s, it was a fraction of that in real terms. 3 of the biggest expenses in American life: housing, healthcare, education, have inflated dramatically faster than wages. Meanwhile, wages have grown in nominal terms, but barely in real terms. The median American worker today earns roughly the same inflation-adjusted wage as the median American worker in 1973. 50 years of economic growth. 50 years of productivity increases. 50 years of technological advancement. And the median American worker is earning roughly the same real wage. Where did all the productivity go? To capital owners, to shareholders, to the top percentile. The system that was supposed to lift all boats stopped lifting working people's boats in the 1970s. And the paycheck-to-paycheck crisis is the direct mathematical consequence. The fixed cost explosion. Here's the specific mechanism that traps people. Financial stress is not primarily about discretionary spending. It's about fixed costs: rent or mortgage, car payment, insurance, healthcare premiums, student loan payments, child care. These are the costs that don't go away when times get hard. They're locked in. You can't cut them on a bad month. And in America, fixed costs have exploded. The average American household today has fixed costs consuming roughly 60 to 70% of take-home income before they spend a single dollar on food, clothing, or anything else. In 1980, that number was roughly 40 to 50%. The increase in fixed cost burden is not because Americans chose more expensive fixed costs. It's because the costs of the essentials of American life: housing, healthcare, education, transportation have increased dramatically faster than income. You can cut your latte. You cannot cut your housing cost without moving. You cannot cut your healthcare cost without going without coverage. You cannot cut your childcare cost without quitting your job. The things that are killing the average American's finances are not discretionary. They're structural. They're the baseline cost of participating in American life. And those costs have risen to the point where many Americans have almost nothing left after paying them. The debt trap as a poverty substitution. Here's what happened when wages stagnated but costs kept rising. Americans were presented with a solution: debt, credit cards, home equity loans, student loans, auto loans. buy now, pay later. Instead of raising wages to match the rising cost of living, the financial system offered a substitute: let people borrow the difference. You can't afford a home on your wage? Here's a 30-year mortgage. You can't afford college? Here's a student loan. You can't afford a medical emergency? Here's a payment plan. Debt allowed people to maintain a standard of living that their wages couldn't support. It felt like a solution. It was actually a trap. Because debt comes with interest, and interest is a transfer of wealth from borrowers to lenders. The average American household pays roughly $1,700 per year in credit card interest alone. That's $1,700 every year flowing from ordinary people to banks, not for anything they bought, for the privilege of having bought things they couldn't afford because wages didn't keep pace with costs. Americans didn't choose debt because they're reckless. They chose debt because the alternative was not being able to afford the basics of American life. And once in debt, the interest payments become another fixed cost that consumes income and prevents savings. The three cost categories that have been weaponized. Let's go deeper on the three specific cost categories that have driven the paycheck to paycheck crisis. Number 1. Housing. The American housing market has been transformed from a basic need into an investment vehicle. Homeowners benefit when housing prices rise. Investors benefit when housing prices rise. Nobody is incentivized to make housing more affordable except renters, who don't vote or donate as effectively as property owners. Zoning laws restrict construction. Regulatory barriers prevent development. Existing homeowners fight new construction because it might reduce their property values. The result: housing supply has not kept pace with housing demand. Prices rise. Renters pay more. Homebuyers take on more debt. In many American cities, the cost of renting a one-bedroom apartment consumes 40 to 50% of a middle-income salary. That's not a personal choice problem. That's a policy and market structure problem. Number 2. Healthcare. The American healthcare system is unique among developed nations in treating healthcare as a market commodity. Other wealthy countries spend roughly 8 to 10% of GDP on healthcare and cover their entire population. America spends roughly 17% of GDP and leaves tens of millions uninsured. The difference is not better outcomes. Americans have worse health outcomes than most peer nations on almost every metric. The difference is profit extraction. Insurance company profit. Hospital system profit. Pharmaceutical company profit. Americans are paying twice as much for healthcare as comparable countries and getting worse outcomes because the system is designed to extract profit, not optimize health. That profit extraction comes directly out of household budgets. Every dollar in healthcare profit is a dollar that could have been wages or savings for American workers. Number 3. Education. The student loan system has been spectacularly successful at doing one thing: transferring wealth from young people to financial institutions. Americans hold approximately $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. This debt was largely created by a simple policy, making student loans government-backed and therefore risk-free for banks, while simultaneously cutting state funding for universities, forcing tuition to rise, while telling young people that college was the only path to success. The result: an entire generation forced to take on enormous debt at the beginning of their working lives. Debt that consumes income for decades. Debt that prevents saving. Debt that prevents wealth building. The psychology of blame that protects the system. Here's what's interesting about the paycheck to paycheck narrative. The system that created the problem has successfully convinced most people that the problem is personal. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, conventional wisdom says, you're spending too much on lattes. You're not disciplined. You're not saving. You're making bad choices. This framing is incredibly useful for the system because it directs attention to individual behavior rather than structural causes. If you're broke because you bought too many lattes, the solution is to buy fewer lattes. The banking system, the healthcare system, the housing market, the student loan industry, none of them need to change. But if you're broke because housing costs have consumed 30% more of your income than they did for your parents, the solution is structural. The blame the individual narrative protects the system from accountability. And because Americans are culturally predisposed to believe in individual responsibility, the narrative works. People internalize it. They blame themselves. They feel shame. They try to fix the problem by cutting expenses rather than by understanding the structural forces that created it. What actually changes things? Understanding the structural causes doesn't mean you're helpless. Within the system as it exists, there are moves that improve your situation. First, ruthlessly optimize your fixed costs. These are the real killers. If you can reduce your housing cost, your insurance cost, your debt payments, these free up significantly more money than cutting discretionary spending. Second, build emergency savings before anything else. Even $1,000 changes your vulnerability to financial shocks dramatically. 3 months of expenses changes it completely. Third, avoid consumer debt like your financial life depends on it, because it does. Interest payments are a direct transfer from your household to financial institutions. Every dollar in consumer debt is a dollar working against you. Fourth, understand the specific ways the system extracts value from you and make decisions that minimize that extraction. That means understanding your insurance costs, your loan terms, your fee structures. Fifth, advocate for structural change. The paycheck to paycheck crisis is not a personal failure problem. It's a structural problem that requires structural solutions. Housing policy, healthcare policy, student loan reform, wage policy. These are political questions that have financial consequences for every working American. 63% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. The conventional story is, they're not disciplined. They spend too much. They make bad choices. The real story is, housing costs have exploded. Healthcare costs have exploded. Education costs have exploded. Wages have not. The system has been engineered to extract maximum value from working people through rising fixed costs, through debt as a wage substitute, and through a blame narrative that prevents accountability. This doesn't mean you're powerless. Individual decisions matter within the system, but understanding that the problem is structural rather than personal, the first step toward making decisions that actually address the real cause rather than the symptoms. You're not living paycheck to paycheck because you're bad with money. You're living paycheck to paycheck because the cost of American life has outrun what American employers are willing to pay. And until that changes, either through your individual decisions to minimize fixed costs and avoid debt, or through structural changes to housing, healthcare, and wages, 63% of Americans will keep living paycheck to paycheck, not because they failed the system, because the system failed them.